Hi guys, so today I wanted to cover the material for analysis in chapter 10 of the Dressmaker, and again we'll be focusing our analysis on how it can be compared with the Crucible. So chapter 10, I'm going to do a quick summary of it before we start. I'm thinking of doing a chapter summary at the start of each of these, just as a quick recap of what happens in each chapter. So it's set on the morning after the dance, and basically we see Beulah Harradine spreading gossip about William, Gertrude, and Tilly, and in the process of seeing her kind of spread the gossip around, we get insights into the townspeople and their lives, especially people like Sergeant Farrett, Beulah Harradine, Ruth Dinn, Nancy Pickett, Lois Pickett, and Irma Almanac. So with chapter 10, we're finally at the start of the second section. Congrats, we've made it more than a quarter of the way through the text. So this section is named Shantung after a fabric which is described as very colourful and vibrant. And that's exactly what Tilly brings to the town, colour and vibrance, hence why it's called Shantung. Okay, so Sergeant Farrett is in his bathtub at the beginning of this chapter, and we see that he's kind of smeared himself with eggs and aloe vera, so a lot of home remedies, and there's a connection to herb lore. And unlike with Tilly, where she uses herbs in a way that is purely medicinal, he uses home remedies with a kind of overtly superstitious utilization. For example, he uses rosemary to stimulate clarity of mind. He's the only other person in the town besides Tilly who uses home remedies, which means that he's not kind of tied to Mr. Almanac, and he's not dependent on Mr. Almanac when he's ill or when he wants to access some kind of, ointment or potion or whatnot. But we also see that he's making clothes for himself again, and we see this kind of contrast between the words used for his clothing and for his body. So we see like fine wool and fat index finger, we see police uniform and thin pale pink socks, delicate apricot ballet slippers tied gently around his firm ankles, so like the words gently and firm. And in conjunction with those home remedies, there's this kind of contrast. So where I write home remedies and I mean the description, they very overtly contrast to describe him in this way that really highlights transgression as well as this defiance towards the system and the community that he's in. So Beulah wants him to enforce the law on one of her whims again, and to distract her, he hands her this knitting piece or magazine and says, "Oh, I'm decoding this. Can you, tell me what all of these abbreviations mean? I know that you're good at secrets." So there's a joke here. He's making fun of her, and once again, there's no reference to her understanding it. But when he says that she's good at secrets, he never says that she's good at keeping secrets, or a good confidant. He just says good at secrets, which could imply that she's good at telling and spreading secrets, which is kind of what's being implied here. And it's also because he's trying to distract her, because he knows that she's going to go off on him and say, "Oh, you have to enforce the law here." Yeah. And there's an irony there, because she just came to his home to tell him about Gertrude and William's private lives, and then he's saying she's good at secrets. It's a very dry humour there. Once again, he's seen as kind of the intellectual superior, because the people who he's making fun of just don't even notice. It just flies over their heads. Okay, we also see Tilly's letters arrive, and Ruth, steams them open. And her letters are in Spanish, so thus far we know that she knows at least 3 languages well enough to understand letters in them. So Tilly knows English, Spanish, and French to some extent. And they're kind of like these subtle flexes to highlight her worldliness and sophistication, especially when you think back to what I said before about Europe and America kind of being the pinnacles of sophistication and progress in the 50s. We also see Reginald Blood going into the pharmacy to get a rash. And once again, this should be quite clear, but I know that sometimes year 12s, because you guys are really busy and just kind of skim reading, sometimes you miss the subtext. So the subtext here is that he caught the STD that Faith had from her because she kept it a secret from him. And if you think about that, it's implicit that she's not faithful to him either, because she got the rash from someone who was not her husband, and we know that because Mr. Almanac has a photograph of her cheating on her husband, and he says that she didn't get the rash from him. Obviously, he might be wrong, but that's kind of the implication there. But given that information alone, we're almost led to believe that she got it from Reginald Blood. But because he caught it from her, we now know that she is also sleeping with other people. And from this example, we see once again, like we did in the case of Gertrude and William, that women hold the power in their society or their community where sex is concerned. And moving on, we then see Beulah Harradine visiting Muriel Pratt at the Pratt store, and we see that Muriel just cannot be bothered with Beulah. So she says, "You don't say." She repeats that twice, and then she says, "I dare say." She doesn't say anything else. And we just see Beulah kind of going off on tangents and talking about Gertrude and William. Now, speaking of Faith and Reginald Blood, it's kind of a good segue to start talking about the distribution of power in the two texts. So, in the case of the Crucible, wealth and class have minimal impact on the rulings of the court. Everyone from, from the drunkards in the street to reputable and clearly financially quite well-off women in their town are accused and they're condemned. But there is one thing that kind of forms a place in which, or a facet of their lives in which they're not equal, and that's gender. So when you look at the trials, the women are accused more often, especially at the start where Betty and Abigail are kind of listing the people who they saw with the devil practicing witchcraft at the end of Act 1, and they only name one male in that entire list. Now, that's kind of the reason why they are more likely to be accused is because they have less legal rights and protections. Now, we see that women weren't allowed to vote for anything in their communities, and women weren't allowed to own properties. So basically, those very concrete forms of power were usually tied to their husbands, which is why it was important for them to get married, because that essentially afforded them security. And that's an interesting point to compare with the dressmaker, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Women's power in their society was softer. They were kind of seen as the moral authority in their own households. And the problem with this is that when you're accused of witchcraft, your kind of record of moral authority and moral goodness comes under fire. So there's nothing protecting you from your rights being taken away, because that one kind of facet of your identity that afforded you some form of consideration in the eyes of your community is suddenly undercut. Now, with the dressmaker, the distribution of power is a little bit more complicated because it's not so much tied to gender as it is about the roles that people play in their highly insular society. So their society is so insular that they need to rely on each other for all these different functions that they play. And that's kind of part of the reason why there's this greater interconnectedness and this greater interdependence. That means that they're all connected and they all depend on each other. So that, how would I put this? So their interconnectedness and their interdependence kind of grant them power, but also at the same time, they reinforce each other. They're a vicious cycle because they need each other, so they all have to respect each other, but at the same time, their society is so insular that they're forced to be connected. But anyway, so if you think about the roles that they play, people like Ruth, despite being a woman, Ruth actually plays quite an important role, and we see that when the town is burned down. It's kind of an oversight on her part and almost a consequence of her not playing her role properly. So we see that despite the fact that she's a woman, she plays a very important role, and as a result, she kind of she's quite, I wouldn't say respected, but she's an essential part of their society. Now, and if you think about the roles that they play in society, Tilly and Molly did not have any crucial part to play in their society, hence why she was an outcast. And the same thing kind of goes with Elsbeth Beaumont, where she doesn't really play a huge role in their community, and as a result, she's almost an outsider too, in a very different way from Molly, in that people tend to dislike her, but less overtly because she has money and she gets involved in some community initiatives and she lives among them. But at the same time, we see that kind of distance from the town reflected in the distance from her home to the rest of the town. But enough about them. What I want to talk about as well is that the distribution of power in their community is also about reputation. So if you think about it, Teddy is someone whose family has a poor reputation, but he plays I wouldn't say essential role, but he's well liked by the people for his character, and in terms of the football game, which is actually very important to them in a symbolic way, he's essential to their footy team. So he gains some degree of conditional acceptance, so that the condition for his acceptance is that he is likable and he plays that function of being, that invaluable full forward for their football team. But in the case of people like Tilly and Molly, reputation is a little less clear, is a little bit more clear cut in terms of its role, because their kind of, their function in their community is perhaps not as important as Teddy's. At least in the case of Tilly, that's the case when they get Una Pleasant, and we'll talk about her later because there's a little joke in her name, Una Pleasant, unpleasant. But yeah, that's kind of a way to discuss the distribution of power in their societies. So in the Crucible, it's about gender. In the Dressmaker, it's about their roles and their functions in their society. Now, I haven't included it on the slide because I want to keep the words clear and large, but there is actually a point of similarity between the two texts in terms of how they portray the distribution of power in the two societies. So in the case of the Crucible, reputation is also important, but it's not really given that much space to be explored. In the Dressmaker, it's also about reputation, as we just talked about. So where in the Crucible do we see reputation kind of mattering? We see it in the case of Rebecca Nurse, but we see that ultimately the power that she had in her reputation is kind of overruled by the paranoia of the town. Now, a case where it's a little bit more concrete is in the case of John Proctor. So when the judges, Danforth, Hale, and whatnot, when they're trying to get him to sign his own admission or his own confession, they say, oh, we need this confession because he's someone who people in the town respect. So if he signs a confession, other people will also confess. So we don't need to kill them all. So that's an example of where reputation is an important factor in the distribution of power in their community. So now back to chapter 10, we see Lois doing a crude job of cleaning, and she handles Irma quite roughly. When she's buttering up the wheelchair. That's very crude to butter up a wheelchair. But anyway, so we see her say, "Need some for your bones, Irma love." So there's this kind of patronizing tone to it with Irma and love being tacked together. And we also see a lack of vocative comma. So here's the thing about Rosalie Ham's writing. She has an editor, so it doesn't really matter whether or not she wanted to include a vocative comma here. If it wasn't intentional, then her editor would have picked up on it, told her about it, they would have fixed it. But in this case, it's completely intentional, so there's no question at all whether or not she intended for it to happen. But anyway, it is intended for her to be missing a vocative comma there. So it kind of reflects Lois's unrefined speech, and we see that as well when she says, "Well, I'm not gossiping or anything." Sorry, anything. I immediately go to anything when I'm speaking in a very unpolished way by default, because that is the kind of like British chav way of speaking, which is quite close to the way that Lois speaks. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Hope you learned something.